The Global Initiative for Boys and Men presents Q&A with filmmaker Ginger Gentile of Erasing Family.
Thank you everyone for rejoining us. My name is Sean Coleman. I'm the president of the Global Initiative for Boys and Men. And I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Mark Sutton. We want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to bring Ginger Gentile into this conversation. Ginger is a Columbia grad, and after Columbia, she moved to Argentina, where she lived for 13 years. I believe that's correct. And, you know, when she did her second film, Erasing Dad, the fact that a film could move a nation to change just speaks not only to the issue, but the ability of a caring person to create something profound enough to change the law. And I think that is really what drew me to Ginger personally. And when she moved back to the States and, and did her documentary on Erasing Family in the States, where we've got a long way to go. But I do think Ginger's film is a step forward. And she has such a great and wonderful documentary. And, you know, her depth and biography is so deep. I'm actually going to send it to everybody. You know, she has a wonderful production lineage, or not lineage, but a production history when she moved to Argentina and worked for San Telmo, right? Was it
right? I co-founded San Telmo Productions. Yes.
Yeah, and you worked with A&E as your clients and National Geographic and Warner Brothers. So, I mean, just really sharp. And I really want to turn this over to Ginger. And why don't you introduce yourself, Ginger, and tell us more about the film and what got you going. And then I'd like Mark to take the Q&As from the people. So thank you, Ginger, for everything you're doing. And thank you for being here tonight.
Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's an honor to be here. And I guess what I can add to that is that wonderful introduction is that when I moved back to the United States, what I always wanted to do a film, a follow-up film, and in English, a more global film. And what I didn't expect to see were so many mothers who contacted me that they couldn't see their kids. And the other thing that I didn't expect to see were children, because social media had really changed from the time I began Erasing Dad in Argentina. We began around 2010. And by the time I started Erasing Family around 2015, everybody was on social media, including kids. And kids as young as 7 were making videos, asking judges to change decisions, making videos saying that they missed a parent or a sibling. And I found everybody through social media. So social media can be a blessing and a curse. And I'm happy to answer questions, general questions about how we can use social media more effectively to communicate our message and also communicate with people who don't want to talk with us if we have erased family members. And after I finished Erasing Family, it debuted at Lincoln Center, New York City. And I also served as the executive director of the National Parents Organization, even though I'm not a parent, and really helped modernize their messaging and build new chapters for the shared parenting movement. So I've been both sides documenting this and also affecting the change. I consider myself an activist filmmaker. I make films that I care about. And currently for the past year, I've been working on a new film, which is a completely different topic. It's about access to higher education. So that's what I'm doing now. And I guess the other thing that's good for people to know is I am a big meditator. And I think it's very important that we all have some sort of practice that grounds us, especially when life gets stressful.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that info. And I wanted to just let everyone know too. So for the people listening, most of the people are probably familiar with our organization, Global Initiative for Boys and Men, GIBM, and we're co-sponsoring this with another nonprofit called Family Reunion. So Family Reunion, they are really more focused on very much specifically the topic of your film. They are about keeping families together and getting rid of this disastrous divorce industry we have here in the United States. And as far as GIBM goes, we are looking at the well-being of boys and men overall. And we have these 5 pillars of male well-being. And one of them is called fatherhood, parenting, and family, which is exactly what your film is about. And it is such an integral and important part of every single human being's life, whatever their family situation is, the better that is, the better their life is. And so this is really just such an important film that is bringing to light all these issues. And so first of all, thank you, Ginger, for just spending the time and energy to just make this incredibly powerful. And it's, it's rare to see a film that does such a good job with the emotional aspect of it, plus the intelligent aspect. You really just you really knocked it out of the park. So thank you. And we've got a few questions, and I had a few comments as well as we get started. Just a few things that kind of struck me in the year, because this film came out about a year ago, right, in 2020. And I mean, you have the scene with Walter, with the gentleman who ran out of his car and was shot. Now, most of us, if we follow the news, probably knew that story. And these police shootings, of course, with George Floyd and everything have been in the news the last several years. But I didn't know that there was a real child support component to that story. And I never once saw that on the news. I was curious how you found out about the child support aspect of that story.
In the New York Times.
Okay.
The New York Times ran an article. We do show it very briefly in the film. It says, skip child support, go to jail, repeat. And Walter Scott was also profiled in a lot of papers as a quote unquote success case because, I mean, basically, to give a little backstory to that, he was actually a filmmaker and he was working at a production company. He had a fairly good job, not a high paying job. I think he was making about $30,000 a year, but working as a filmmaker. And he fell behind on his child support. As the family said, they were all doing this family effort to pay it, and they feel like the interest just kept compounding. And so he went to jail for 6 months, and that really destroyed his life because he lost his job. Once you're in jail, it's very hard to get another job. He turned to alcoholism, and his life began to, so then the debt kept on accruing, and while you're in jail, you still have to pay. The debt keeps accruing, so he goes to jail again. And what his family suspects is that he ran because he just didn't want to go back to jail. And then it ended with, so the way the family looks at it is that his motivation for running was child support. The killing was a racist act because the police officer didn't know that. He went back to run the plates and probably didn't even know that there was an arrest warrant. He just saw someone run and then shot him in the back. And I think what's interesting too is when people were talking about the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, that he was a father and a devoted father. And that often gets left out of the narrative when we talk about these senseless killings, because that it's that part of the life that we focus on and not the relationships that these people leave behind. And just if people forget it from the film, Walter Scott's children were living with him when he was murdered.
Wow. Thank you for that. Another interesting thing I really like, and I got a few questions here already, and please keep the questions coming. We'll get to all of those in the next few minutes. In Baltimore County, the mediator on staff, I thought that was a very interesting model, and I had not seen that before. So thank you for portraying that in the film. And I can see why the divorce lawyers don't like that, because it's just completely undercutting their business, and the governments don't like it because, as you so clearly showed in the film, governments are addicted to money, and this is a revenue stream for them. And they will do, if you've ever been to any sort of budget hearing at any level, you will see that, these budgets are sacrosanct, and they never want to lose money. So is there any big push for this mediation movement?
No.
Okay, so this is the very thing.
I mean, so there are people who are advocating for it. What do you mean by big push? Do you mean that there's a top-down approach?
Yeah, I mean, is there a big
really
for this? I've never heard. I live in San Francisco. I've never heard of it here. I'm not really involved with family courts, but I've just never heard of that. So
right. So there's a lot of people who work in the family court who are divorce attorneys who are very dissatisfied with the way things are going. Mm-hmm. And they're going into collaborative law, which is when both parties are represented by counsel, but they agree prior to not go to trial. Now, there have been less than 50,000 divorces that have used collaborative law in the US since its inception 30 years ago. So wow. It's a very small number. But right, and part of it is because it's quicker and it keeps costs down dramatically. I think also an issue too is that a lot of people who do end up suffering from parental alienation have experienced low quality mediation, because mediation in a high conflict situation has to be very different than, well, you two work it out, I'm just here to kind of write stuff down. And so I think also people who are in this movement to reform family court often dislike mediation because they've had a bad experience. I always say there's different types of mediators, and these mediators have to be specially trained. But I remember when I first saw this, it was at an AFC conference, and AFCC conference, sorry, and they presented this, and all the people in the room said, our courts would never go for this. And it seems like such an obvious solution and such a win-win.
Yeah.
And it's just like people are very stalled on disrupting, you know, the family court. I mean, a lot of people have said the family model has changed so much in the past 50 years, and this is something that needs to be disrupted. And we're still using these old mechanisms that have been kind of grandfathered in. And no one's really thinking about how can we change this, because as you said, there's so much financial interest to keep things the way they are.
Yeah, great point. Great. I want to get to a question that was emailed into us. This one says, I feel that parental alienation is on the brink of becoming a global talking point, given its impact on the family and wider society. How can we break out of the bubble of people who already know about parental alienation and make it more mainstream?
So that's a great question. It's a very big question. And I would focus on that the issues that the people who talk about it are tend to be people who are suffering from it. And for a movement to be successful, you need people who are either no longer suffering from it or who haven't suffered from it, leading it. And everybody wants to tell their story, and talking to the media can't be therapy. Even today, a guy was like, he saw that I now have a column in Forbes, and which is very ironic if you think of my political background. But anyway, and he was like, I need to tell you my story. And I was like, well, it's for the women's section, you know. And he's like, well, then who do I talk to in the men's section? I was like, well, there's no men's section, that's just Forbes. But I was like, but no one is going to want to cover your story. It's not a good story. You're not a good representative. And everyone wants to tell their story. And a movement to be successful has to very carefully select who are the spokespeople for that movement. So if you look at other movements that have been very successful, such as the right for same-sex marriage, when they argued that case before the Supreme Court, out of all the people who wanted to get married, they picked who they thought was the most appropriate couple. And this was also the same even in the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks was not the first woman to not give up her seat on the bus. There was another woman who did that a few months prior or a year prior, but she was a single mom who was 16 with a truancy record. So I think that's part of it, is the professionalization, the need to realize that if people get on board, they need to be accepted. I see so many times people say, I talk to a politician and they say, oh, that politician is full of BS. That it's like, well, you're not welcoming to people if they change their mind, if they want to learn about this. And the other thing is to talk, you know, really getting in the weeds and making an issue more complicated. Like I was at a parental alienation study group conference. People kept on saying, this is counterintuitive. This is counterintuitive. You need specialized people. And I was like, everybody knows about this. Everybody has a family member who doesn't speak to another family member after divorce. Yeah. And you're trying to say, you know, this is counterintuitive and so complicated. And you're kind of limiting yourself by saying that it's complicated. By putting all these weird psychological terms, right, and getting very obsessed with terminology. So I think that would be the key thing. And then I think you also, you know, the anger has to go. I go on some Facebook groups and this is, I mean, I could go on all night about this, so please stop me when you want me to stop. And they're all this, my ex did this, my ex did that, my ex did this, my ex did that, my ex is horrible. And everyone goes, your ex is horrible, your ex is horrible, your ex is horrible, you're right, the ex is so horrible, the ex is so horrible. And people avoid that like the plague.
As to the parental alienation, then when you have people going on these message boards, I know I use Reddit a lot too. And then whenever there's a relationship thing on Reddit, it's the same thing, like, oh, you were right, that person was horrible, you should get a divorce, and that person's
Right.
the Antichrist, and and it
Yeah.
just steamrolls like that. So maybe it's like us being friendlier to each other on social media and Facebook and groups and different things like that is
And
part
also
of that
stopping
message.
to use the language like about rights. A lot of people say it's my right to see my kid, and no one has sympathy for that because people don't care about the parents. So everyone wants to talk about how much they suffered, and like it's unsympathetic. I mean, and Warren Farrell has talked a lot about this, that men complaining in particular, or men being angry, is just a turn off to everybody. So I really think that this has to come from the children who have suffered, being the spokespeople. And I've talked to people who are just starting bills. I'm like, do you have a kid who will speak, or an adult child? And they go, oh, I met one, but I lost their contact information. I'm like, really? Like, these are the people you need to be cultivating.
Yeah, and some of the adults in your film, I mean, were really sympathetic, particularly, Dizzy and his whole story was such a great plot line. I want to get to the next question here. So this one comes from Blair. His question is, I got the impression from a part early in the film that the country of Argentina flipped from bad to good in terms of this topic. Can you talk about that? Did they have a more centralized system as opposed to the 50 different state systems that we have to improve in the US?
So first of all, Argentina didn't flip from bad to good. Argentina enacted legislation allowing for joint custody.
So they at least allowed for it, whereas before it wasn't even allowed. So it was, you
right.
said
So before there was no, you couldn't have joint custody.
So now it's just, it could happen, but it's not the presumption. It's not presumptive parenting.
No.
Okay.
But I feel so for a film to have that impact of changing a law and getting a conversation going, I think for a very small film, that's a big impact. It's not a model country at all. So I think, but yes, it is a more centralized system. And I think also the film had a lot of impact because people were so desperate to have positive messaging about this that people really promoted the film. And I think because in the United States and Canada, there's just a lot going on in the parental alienation world. Parents haven't really been using this, promoting the film in a way so it could have as much impact as it did in other countries. But I don't think, I mean, the other thing too is like, you can't legislate away parental alienation. So what you can legislate is custody. You can legislate how the family courts work, but people often say we should make parental alienation legal, and I think that's just a bad idea, because then when you get to legislating psychology as opposed to actions, I just feel like it's very dangerous, or it's ignored.
Yeah.
What I found interesting about that question, mind if I chime in?
Sure.
Is the whole idea of a centralized system, right? What you're really talking about there is national reform. Right. And so you have these 50 states with these 50 laws. And so maybe you could I found that part of the question very interesting. This is centralized, is that maybe something the United States needs to sort of do, is kind of create this, larger reform, something like that, Ginger?
Well, I mean, you can't, because you have a federal system. So you'd have to change the Constitution and take the family court system out of the states.
So, yeah.
So
the
the short answer is no. It is going to have to be kind of one state by state. What I think the movement is missing, though, is to say, okay, well, what's the strength of this model? That you could have you could try something out in one jurisdiction, which is actually the county level. And if you could set up like one good thing, like in Baltimore County, which again isn't perfect, but maybe have a triage center and really focus on getting one county to work well, then you could export that model. So sometimes by thinking big, you end up missing the small. So I think what the movement needs is to take one area and really make it a model that then can be exported once it works.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to follow up with that Baltimore situation too, because that's a really exciting model, and it makes sense. I have a friend who got divorced, and he told me, we were talking about this the other day, and And when he got divorced, he and his wife were very amicable, and they said, "We just want the simplest thing. We just want to," kind of like the Swedish couple in your film. And it was a family court judge was trying to tell the woman, "No, no, you should be getting money from him. You should be getting more money, and that you shouldn't sign this. This is bad for you. Get a lawyer and come back and sue him." And she's like, "What? We're happy. We don't want this fighting. We're going to go our separate ways amicably. We're all good." And they said, "Fine." And they did, the judge did eventually, approve it, but it's like, why do we have this system that makes people combatants against each other? It's frustrating. Great, next question. This one comes from Jack. Jack asked, he said, "Fabulous documentary. Question for Ginger. Are you available for a discussion about coming to Maryland early next year to be the featured guest at an event in Annapolis?" So this could maybe be a follow-up after.
Sure. You can contact me, info@erasingfamily.org. The information is also on our website.
Great. And he wants to show Erasing Family and also promote legislation to establish for a rebuttable presumption for shared parenting in the state. So that's
wonderful.
So that's great. So Jack, go ahead and email Ginger at the info@erasingfamily.org.
Yes.
Right. And that's great. And you guys set that up. Fantastic. Great. Next question. We have a question from Jeannie. Jeannie asked, "Has NPO and Family Reunion considered working with the Aspen Institute?" I'm not sure exactly. Is that National Parents Organization, Sean?
Yes.
Is that Ned Holstein? Yeah.
That's not.
Well, Ned Holstein is retired.
Yeah, Ned's retired. Okay. It's
Don Cuban, I think, is he's still running it.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask them.
Okay, yeah, this isn't about the film exactly. Somebody else is just saying, and Jeannie also just commented, yes, the Baltimore example, the local one highlighted in the film, effort initiative sounds like a really good idea to look into as a best practice to possibly replicate nationwide. So she's agreeing with that. So great. So yeah, that was a question about the Ascend at Aspen Institute, which is, I guess, it supports fatherhood and a bunch of fathering programs. So something to look into. Great, thanks for that, Jeannie. Next question, we have a question from Derek. Derek asks, what do you think of the revalorization of parents? Probably mostly dads, but also mothers' roles. Is it possible in the US? So I guess just the re-promotion of the heroic nature of parenthood, or the valorization of parenthood, I guess, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I look at that question, the importance of parenting. And I think one of the things that you addressed, Ginger, when you talked about the confrontation, I hate him, I hate her. I mean, and it's going to sound, it's not about you, it's about the kids. It's always about the kids, no matter whether you teach, it's always about the kids. And so I really am happy that you emphasize that. And so I think this revalorization, the notion that we need to talk about as a, may sound, maybe it sounds childish, as a parent, you are responsible and that sort of thing. And you need to make sure that your energies are directed towards your children. And maybe that's what Derek is trying to get at. And I could certainly, we all see the value in that, but maybe you could even, talk a little more personally about the role of maybe your parents, or, some of you, if you discussed at the beginning of the film and how that kind of influenced you, because there's this kind of, I don't know if you want to, it's up to you. If not, it's completely fine.
I'll skip.
Okay, great. No, thank you. And I appreciate that. But I kind of found it lent that way. I mean, I can tell you as a father, how my wife and I kind of divvy up things. It's always about the kids. It's always about the kids. So I really want to thank you for that as well. And Mark, is there anything else you want to bring up in the film?
Sure. So I had a question. In the scene where Dizzy is paying off, I love the Dizzy character. I just thought he was an interesting person, so personable, not a perfect human being, but a very loving father, clearly, and, trying to do the right thing, paying off all that child support. And he paid off the final one. But then you talked about how states or governments, I'm assuming a state government, takes this child support payments and they charge all these fees and all those interest if you're in arrears. And then if the mother is on welfare, or the other parent is usually the mother, but the other parent, if the other parent is on welfare, that they don't give any of that money. They just say they figure, well, we're already paying welfare, so we get to keep all the child support, essentially. That's what they're saying.
Yes.
And so is that, see, that was in California. Is that pretty much how all states operate?
I know that's all states. So all states, I mean, I'm always reluctant to say all states because someone's like, well, in North Dakota, so, and that's because from the federal level, there are directives and incentives from the federal government to recover child support. So the federal government say for every dollar of child support you recover, we'll give you $1. So that's why the states are incentivized to do all these things like putting people in jail and having all these recovery methods. So in Dizzy's case, 2 things happened. So I'm not sure exactly how much he owed, but let's say he didn't pay $2,000.
Mm-hmm.
That with the interest payments ballooned up to 30,000.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interest never goes to the parent in most cases. It goes to the state. So when he says it's not going to my ex, it's not going to the kids, it's going to pave potholes. And then I interviewed the mother and she said, I had no idea, I never got any of that money. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you receive welfare or let's put a pin on foster care for a second. This is also interesting. So if the mother receives welfare, and it's normally the mother because also it's almost impossible for men in the US to get welfare, as far as I know, because it's actually called Aid for Women and Dependent Children or something like that. So let's say the mother files for welfare, and welfare in the US is very low. So it's about $200 a month, and the child support is $600 a month. They will take the 200 out of the child support and put it towards the welfare, and then they'll keep the 400. Now, if your children go to foster care, put in foster care, you might also be responsible for paying their foster care parenting fees.
Wow, I didn't know that. And would both parents be liable for those foster care fees?
I'm not sure, but whoever's the parent, yeah.
Wow, I've never heard it, because I do understand, I know in California, parents who are foster parents do get some support from the state. So that's the support that you're
So the
saying.
state is saying, well, we need to recuperate this $2,000 we're giving the parent from. It's the parents' responsibilities who messed up and now their kids are in foster care. I mean, to go up to child support, I think it's important to remember that child support, I mean, not important to remember, you wouldn't know this. Child support wasn't invented to help children. Child support was invented as a way, because the model was, and this was 100 years ago, well, if there's a single mother with kids, they are going to be dependent upon the state for welfare, for orphanages, for workhouses, whatever they did 100 years ago. So the state needs to recuperate this through child support. It was never, let's ensure the kid has stuff. It was, let's create less of a burden on the state for taking care of unwed mothers in workhouses and orphanages, or homes for unwed mothers, whatever they had.
Yeah, and it really does seem like it's one of these industries that's gotten so out of control. And I mean, I remember as a little kid, because my parents, fortunately, I lived in a household where my parents were married and were married for over 50 years. But I remember seeing the film Kramer versus Kramer in 1984 and just thinking, holy crap, that's horrible. And I actually went with a friend to one of his parental hearings in New York City when I lived there, and it happened to be in the exact same courtroom as that movie,
Wow.
which was kind of wild. But it has been set up for years. Like, it's interesting to hear the history of how you talked about that. It's just been set up, as I mentioned before, to create this adversarial situation. And I think one of the people in your film who said, you get people in here arguing against each other and saying how bad they are, then you expect them to walk outside the building and then work together to raise their kids after they just trashed each other. It's just the whole system is set up on so many levels completely, in my opinion, obviously they want to protect children if there's any sort of abuse or anything like that. That's understandable, but just creating this adversarial situation is so tough. And then you combine that with the parental alienation, and wow.
And well, it's interesting, Ginger, what you bring up. It's Woodward and Bernstein, right? Follow the money, the money, right? I feel like we're back reading the Post, and maybe you could even speak on that a little more. The money part of it is really upsetting because I look at families who are incapable of meeting their legal obligation. I mean, to pay an attorney, and it really is upsetting because they really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think you do a great job in the film of really discussing that money trail but maybe you could talk about it in another way that we haven't thought about, some insights other than the film. Is that, you know?
Could you be a little more specific?
Yeah, like really, I mean, I think you get, I think like, you really get into how it impacts, families of really poor means, but, and the cost, but, could you explain maybe on even like a middle-class family?
Oh, sure.
Its impact?
So I met a man who, son of somebody very famous, so he had access to money, and he was suffering this issue. And he decided, he made the decision that he would spend up to $400,000 to get his daughters back. $400,000.
Yeah.
You know how quickly $100,000 was spent? It was spent on one motion that he lost.
Wow.
So if you're wealthy, I always say if you're poor, you have no access to justice. If you're wealthy, you'll lose everything.
Wow, that's that. I mean, I think that says it all, and it gets back to the heart of the matter is, so much of the resources would be better spent on mental health services,
Right.
counseling and all those other things, which I think are just so important. And I do worry about kids. We recently released some data graphic information on opioid and suicide deaths and things like that. And these are the fallouts of all that.
Right.
Fallout. You look at these kids and where they come from, and I don't know how familiar you are with that, but where they come from, it's a lot of times it's divorced family, there's not a parent involved, and those sorts of things.
So you might have children who are doing very well academically. You might have children who are looking for love in all the wrong places. I mean, that's the classic joke, she has daddy issues, so she's a stripper.
Mm-hmm.
I think also you have basically children kind of, always, being caught in the loyalty blind. I think it's hard for me to talk about children.
Yeah.
Because everything is so specific. We can say in the cases of parental alienation, that children really want to avoid conflict. So they really make a very logical decision to appease the parent who has more control, who they live with, who also might be seen also as the more fun or stronger parent. And I think a lot of alienated parents hate to hear this, that if you always come crying, saying, woe is me, I'm the victim, the kid might say, well, I don't want to align myself with victim parent over here who's crying all the time. I want to align myself with the strong parent who might also be the abusive parent. And that's why it's so important for parents to remain strong and positive, especially around their children, because children will often reject a parent who is broken. And that's very hard for some parents to hear, but playing the martyr card backfires in a lot of these cases.
That was an excellent answer. So maybe it wasn't. That's a great answer.
Okay.
And
Thanks, Ginger. We've got a two-parter here from Jack.
Okay.
I think this would be our last question. We're getting running out of time here, so it's a two-parter. So I guess our last two questions here. The attempts to block the showing of your films remind me of what happened to Cassie J in her film The Red Pill. Any comments about the attempts to block your film from being shown? I guess let's do this one first, and then I'll ask the second one after.
So does he mean erasing dad? Okay. I don't know much about the attempts to block the Red Pill, except I kind of generally know what happened. So in Argentina, what happened was that the people who we interviewed in the film, being that they're very powerful in the court system, got an injunction against the film. Even though they had signed releases, these were not hidden cameras of them, though there were hidden cameras in the film. And they also didn't say that we misrepresented their words. Their claim was that they thought they were participating in a documentary about gender and divorce. I never said which gender. And they thought they didn't like the way the film made them look.
And were they successful with those?
So they were able to block the film from being shown in Argentina. We had to take it off of YouTube, all of the internet channels, all of the film screenings for about 9 months.
Wow.
A year. I forget the actual date. I do remember when YouTube actually called us and said that they were allowing the film back on YouTube. So they actually called our house.
So did you get a lawyer to fight that, or did you just do it?
Oh yeah, I mean the lawyers in the film. I mean, what was interesting though is at one point they kept on like really doing a smear campaign against us, and at one point the producer jokes, "Do you think they're going to try to get the film censored?" And they're like, "They're not that stupid because everybody wants to see a censored film." And then the media was like, "Well, why is there so much uproar against this film?" And then we went on all the talk shows, and it was on front page news because journalists don't like censorship as a general rule. So in a way, it was great publicity. When it was happening, it was incredibly stressful for me. Our phones were tapped. I mean, there was a lot of, just crazy stuff going on. Yeah. And it was also at a time where they had just killed or suicided a district attorney. So it's just like, and like, I remember like my producer who's Argentine, he was like, "Oh, they're throwing bodies out of the streets again. That's how they send messages." And I'm just like freaking out. Everyone's like, "Don't take it personally." Like roll with it. And so because just to like, that's also a whole nother talk, but basically, and we didn't really realize this at the time. And if you watch Erasing Dad, which is free on YouTube, there are English subtitles. It's a very different film. That's much more of a true crime expose film. There's murder in it if you like your murders. I shouldn't joke about that because it's a horrible murder, but what we didn't realize is that both political parties, or all the political parties, because there's multiple political parties in Argentina, would use funding for domestic violence shelters as kind of their petty cash box. Because we'd always see that funding for domestic violence stuff would go up, so would the rates. So it's like, well, if there's more funding, shouldn't the rates be going down? It was just a huge amount of funding, and that's because nobody would vote against domestic violence funding, and the political parties would use this. And so that's what they were upset about.
Aha. Again, there's a money issue in there as well. There's a money
issue. And if you watch Erasing Dad, you'll see we don't even say that in the film. All someone says is, they go like, "And be careful, there's a lot of money in this." Wow. And that's it. And that was enough to really freak people out that they would begin investigating what was going on with that. And also people were very surprised that it was a film, because I went to a documentary conference and was like, "Oh, my film's getting censored." People were like, "Did you make one about Monsanto and GMOs?" Like, I was like, "No, about child custody hearings." And they're like, "Who cares about that?" That's people's reaction.
It's such a major issue. Censored. Yeah, and you mentioned murder too, but I mean, it's sadly, I mean, I'm a bit of a true crime fan sometimes. Yeah. And it's one of the motives for murder sometimes. Oh, yeah. Like people say, "I want my kids," and they kill them. Or sometimes you hear these situations where there's a bitter custody dispute, and sadly, the person who's not winning takes the kids and kills them and themselves, and it's just absolutely horrible. This is very, very serious stuff. All right, so let's go to our last question. Is there any, and this is again from Jack, is there any major force other than lawyers who are blocking the progress of shared parenting?
Not that I know of.
So it's mostly the divorce lawyer industry that's really saying, "Hey, this is horrible."
Yes, it's mainly the lawyers, the judges. I think it is important though that there has been a shift that many judges will say, if there isn't a good reason, I think shared parenting is good. Kids should have equal time with both. So there's a cultural shift, and you can never legislate with the worst cases, which I think is what people want to do. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot that can be done with judicial education as well. I think there's also just, the messaging, the organization has to be modernized, and things have to be, very carefully curated what the messaging is and what the talking points is. One of my first jobs as a journalist when I was 16, I covered the Republican National Convention. And one thing that amazed me is that everybody had the same talking points. You'd go to any delegate on the floor and ask them a question. And I'm talking or an intern, right? And they would say, it was so annoying as a reporter, but they would say the exact same sentence. So you can't, but people, they go off on stuff or, and there needs to be very serious press training and a lot of strategy about passing a law. And it also means, because in some states people say, well, we've been bringing legislation up every 2 years for 20 years. And I'm like, well, stop. Go home, do something else. If you tried something 10 or 20 times, it's not working, there has to be a change in strategy.
Yeah, different strategy, right?
Right.
Strategy?
And I think people get very attached, or they go for the law and not the education first.
Interesting. So educate people first and then push the law, as opposed to just.
Well, if you know judges and lawyers are against it, get the judges and lawyers on your side.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because most people who are legislators, they're lawyers. Yeah. Probably, I'm going to guess 60% of elected officials have a law degree. Mm-hmm. So if the lawyers are against it, so that's the other problem too. It's not that the lawyers are just spending tons of money and bribing and doing backroom deals. It's just these are their friends. They all went to law school together. They're all members of the Bar Association. That's who writes laws, because they have law degrees. So there should be more effort talking to lawyers. And a lot of lawyers are very frustrated by what they see. And they want change. Sometimes they don't know what that change would actually look like. But that's why, showing the film Erasing Family and other things like it. Because I often say to people, well, get a conversation going first instead of just going in with legislation. And if you look at, Kentucky, which was successful with their legislative efforts, they really did a good job of building a coalition, always showing up smiling, always showing up with diverse group of people. Mm-hmm. Which also, I'll throw this out there. I've been getting a lot of people saying, we've been told by people they don't want to support this because they see this as a white male issue. I'm like, well, do you have women who can go with you? Oh, well, we don't know any women who would go with us. Or people who say, I don't see how this speaks to the African-American community. Do you have an African-American person who will go with you? No, it's well, then work on that first.
Yep.
But being strategic is a lot of times also people who are who work in legislators, who are elected representatives, they have their constituency in their district who's made up of a certain population, but also they might say, I don't know if they're Navajo, I also speak for the Navajo people, and that's my role in this legislative body. So you should be aware of that and then play to that, as opposed to ignoring it and then calling me up, because people say, oh, can you go speak to the legislature? I was like, I'm happy to, but you realize if I go to Texas, I'm a carpetbagger. Mm-hmm.
Right, then they're not going to be as receptive.
You need a Texan to do that, and especially in Texas of all places. Find Texan professors, find Texan lawyers, find Texan filmmakers to go speak. Then you can show my film, that's great. I can do a Q&A, but I should not be lobbying in Texas. Right. And what people do is they tend to call the same experts. I remember there was one hearing where all the experts were from out of state. And it's it almost hurts you.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw this really recently with the Amazon Union Drive, where one of the criticisms was there were so many famous people from out of state encouraging people to vote for the union that it really backfired in Alabama. So I mean you need people who
trust these people from outside. We want to make it more homegrown and more organic.
Get Miss Texas on board.
Yeah.
I'm being very stereotypical with that one, but that would really work. And by the way, Miss Alabama from 10 years ago, her platform was against parental alienation because she suffered it. So I mean, that's out there, and those kids are out there. You have to really find them, and that would really work in Alabama. Would that work in New York? No, but you need to work with what your culture is.
Yep.
So I think that's something, but to see that as a positive challenge, as opposed to really lamenting the lack of something, or that something's not working, to really examine why it's not working, make changes.
Cool. Well, Ginger, great answer, great film. We really appreciate you joining us tonight to discuss the issues and discuss your film. Again, we've been speaking with Ginger Gentile, the director and filmmaker of Erasing Family. It's available on YouTube. Tell your friends. Of course, you all just probably watch it on YouTube unless you had seen it previously. You can go to her website, erasingfamily.org. And this was co-sponsored by us, the Global Initiative for Boys and Men, as well as the nonprofit Family Reunion. I'm Mark Sutton, and Sean Coleman, our president. on behalf of all of us at GIBM, thank you, Ginger, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Cool. And thanks for everyone who joined us and who asked some questions, very exciting questions. And we will see you. We've got a couple more webinars coming up in the next couple months. We're looking at Don Dutton and Warren Farrell in the upcoming months for webinars. So stay tuned for information about those. But for now, good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Learn more at www.gibm.us.